In 539 BCE, following the fall of Babylon, Cyrus the Great of Persia began sending slaves to Jerusalem and the surrounding area. Naturally, these settlers came into conflict with the inhabitants of the land, and the dispute of ownership would last for generations. To settle this dispute, the new arrivals brought with them a new theology and a new history, one which centered around a folk hero who led a displaced people to the land they were promised, thus establishing these settlers not as foreigners, but as natives returning home. The native theology and people were painted as blasphemous, and a new government was installed. At its head was a governor loyal to Persia. In 520 BCE, Governor Zerubbabel took office in Jerusalem, where he served his Persian masters by running the province of Judah. This man, whose name means son of Babylon, needed some means of legitimizing himself to both the native population and the settlers whom he led. To match their nationalist ideals, he was made to be a descendant of a long-forgotten king, a king whose name appeared in no king list, inscriptions, genealogies, or writings prior to the time of Zerubbabel. A king named David. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the last episode, David's son Absalom conquered Israel and Judah with a grand army of around 200 men, and David fled the palace to hide in the wilderness with his own small army. The palace was left in the care of 10 of David's concubines, and the disgraced king ascended the nearby Mount of Olives to bemoan his fortune and worship at a hilltop shrine that should have been destroyed centuries ago, as they had all been outlawed numerous times in the previous books. This particular scene, a distraught divine king of the Jews weeping atop the Mount of Olives before facing and conquering death, will be mined by the gospel authors for their protagonist, but that's a topic for another episode. We need to turn our attention back to Absalom, who, like David's other son Solomon, is also named for the sunset god of Jerusalem, the god Shalman. In this case, Absalom means Shalman is my father, so you must consider the possibility that Absalom was a mythic figure akin to Hercules, a demigod with a human mother and celestial father. Such figures were common in the ancient world and often listed as fictive kings or the ancestors of kings, such as a claim that Alexander the Great was descended from the aforementioned Hercules. Now that Absalom has captured Jerusalem, he must show the nation that he not only sits on the throne, but is up to the task of replacing his father and ruling the nation. Since the king of an ancient city or nation was associated with virility, and that virility was linked with the fertility of the land, it's fitting that Absalom's demonstration involves sex. And since he's demonstrating himself as a replacement of his father, his sexual act involves the 10 concubines left by David to mind the palace in his absence. At the suggestion of Ahithophel, his advisor, Absalom takes the concubines to the rooftop, the same location where David stood to spy on the bathing Bathsheba, and has intercourse with all 10 women. He has now displaced his father in the throne room and the harem, and shown the nation, who all gathered to watch the spectacle, that he possesses the virility to bring fertility and prosperity to the nation of Israel. Now, to fully understand this scene, one must understand the sacred kingship theology, whereby the king was not only a ruler, but a divine figure personally linked with the prosperity of the land that he governed. Bringing fertility to the land often involved ritual sex with a priestess or a temple prostitute, in an act symbolic of the gods of nature fertilizing the land. For a closer look at this practice and its influence on Near Eastern theology, go back to episode 34, The Origins of Christmas. At this time, David is still in hiding, and is met by one of the servants of Mephibosheth, the grandson of the deceased King Saul, and son of David's dear friend and possible lover, Jonathan. This servant, named Ziba, brings food and wine for David's men. While this small act of aid is welcomed by some of the men, others in David's company were not so easily appeased and began hurling insults at the king, calling him a villain. A few of David's men offered to kill the dissenters, but David would have none of it. He ignored the verbal abuse and forbade any acts of retribution against the men who insulted him. Now that Absalom is in charge, he must figure out what to do about his father. David is still alive and has an army, which makes him dangerous, so he has to be removed. Absalom seeks the counsel of his advisors, Ahithophel and Hushai. Ahithophel was David's advisor who betrayed the king and went over to Absalom. But Hushai is a David loyalist who pretended to defect so he could act as a spy inside Absalom's court. Ahithophel requests 12,000 soldiers so he can pursue David and kill him, thus ending the problem once and for all. He will then bring back those who follow David and reunite the nation so that the reign of Absalom will know peace. This raises the question of why he would need 12,000 men when David fled from 200. This seems like a great plan. It's what every villain in every movie should do. Kill the hero at the earliest convenience before they have the opportunity to slip away and cause trouble. Just to be sure about the plan, Absalom consults his other advisor, Hushai. Hushai says that this plan isn't so great. Why? Because David is a fearsome warrior. I guess none of them recall how David just fled from 200 people, but whatever. He says that if they chase after David, then the people of Israel will side with the former king. Wait, whose side are the people of Israel on? One minute they're loyal to Absalom, and this allows him to take the throne. Then, when David leaves the city, we're told that the entire nation of Israel was on his side. Now we're told that they're on Absalom's side, but they'll turn on him if he pursues David. Okay, we'll say they're on Absalom's side, but if he marches on David, they'll turn against him, so it's best that they don't pursue him. So with that in mind, what does Hushai suggest? He proposes that Absalom summon all of Israel and pursue David. What? How does any of this make sense? It reminds me of the script of Plan 9 from Outer Space, where the aliens are trying to simultaneously reveal their presence to the world and remain hidden from everyone and willing to kill in order to accomplish both goals. Yeah, it's sort of like that. If Absalom pursues David with 12,000 men, Israel will turn against him, but if he pursues David with a greater army, then Israel will not feel bad for David? It doesn't add up. Anyway, Absalom likes Hushai's plan, which is really the same as Ahithophel's plan, which he rejected. And then Yahweh himself steps into the room and weighs in, tossing his vote in with Hushai. Now this should tip Absalom off that it's a trap, because he's worried about people turning against Yahweh's anointed king, so he understands that David still has Yahweh's favor. But despite his maneuvering, he's apparently not that clever, and falls for the blatant trap. We're told in 2 Samuel 17:14 that Yahweh wished to nullify Ahithophel's advice so he could bring ruin to Absalom. So why allow David to be displaced and Absalom to rule if he wanted David to remain on the throne? Why not just have David rule in peace? Perhaps it's because they had various folktales about various rulers and wanted to portray David as the man who conquered all of them. Or perhaps Yahweh's just mysterious like that. Anyway, Hushai tells the priests Zadok and Abiathar about the plan so they can inform David. They do so, basically saying, "Run away, an army is coming," which David already knew. Apparently, Yahweh's greatest general couldn't figure that part out. So David crosses the river and goes on the run. Now, Jonathan and Ahimaaz were using a slave girl to send messages back and forth between David and his spies in the palace, but she was spotted by some random kid who runs off and informs the king. So Absalom sent his men to hunt down Jonathan and Ahimaaz, but they were hidden by the locals in a well, so the soldiers returned empty-handed. Now that Hushai's plan was in full swing and the army was being assembled, Ahithophel realized that his plan had been rejected, so he did the rational thing and continued to serve as Absalom's advisor. Just kidding. He went home and killed himself because his first piece of advice had been ignored. How did he serve David all those years without his thin skin leading to an early demise? Absalom appoints a new commander of his army, a man named Amasa. Now, this individual wouldn't be worthy of note except for his relations. We're told he was a son of Ithra, who married a woman named Abigail, the daughter of Nahash. Why does this matter? Because Nahash is the name of a deity, the serpent associated with the healing and wisdom that we first saw in the Garden of Eden, and later as a brass idol used by Moses to heal the venomous snake bites of the seraphim serpents that Yahweh sent to kill the Israelites. So we have another mention of a person named for an ancient Israelite deity. Actually, we have several mentions of people named for the snake god in the books of Samuel and Kings, such as Nahash, king of Ammon, in 1 Samuel 11:1, Hunam, son of Nahash, in 2 Samuel 10:2, and finally King Jehoiakim's mother was named Nehushta in 2 Kings 24:8. All of these theophoric names reveal that, at the time these books were written, devotion to Nehushtan was widespread and deeply rooted. With the entirety of Israel marching against them, David set captains over his small army, dividing them up by the thousands. Wait, he has multiple thousands of soldiers, but fled at the sight of 200 men? Okay, but he still has to face the entirety of the Israelite army, which we learn in chapter 24 numbers in at 1.3 million. So David was about 3,000 and Absalom has 1.3 mil. How does this play out? David wants to ride out with his army, but his captains insist he remain behind, so he tells them to go gently on his son. His army is outnumbered 433-1, and he tells them to go easy on the enemy. Sure he does. So they march out and hit the Israelite army head-on and kill 20,000 of them, forcing the Israelites to retreat. So they kill 1.5% of the army, and that's enough to send them all running. Yeah, this math doesn't quite add up. Anyway, Absalom himself was apparently in the thick of it and fled on his battle mule. During the retreat, his long hair got caught in the branches of a tree, and he's yanked bodily from the saddle to dangle by the hair from the branches of a tree like some sort of Warner Brothers cartoon character. After the battle is over, he's found still dangling in the air. The men reported back to Joab and said they wouldn't be responsible for killing one of David's children. So Joab and his men rode over and slaughtered Absalom while he was still swinging by the hair from a tree branch. He then sounded the horn and called off the pursuit of the Israelites. Apparently the 3,000 men loyal to David were still chasing an army of 1.3 million across the countryside. When David learns that Absalom is dead, he acts surprised, as if he didn't just send his apparently indestructible army out to fight. He whines and wishes that he had died instead of Absalom. If he felt that way, he might have just, let himself be killed instead of fighting. But that's hindsight for you. The troops joined David in mourning, but the king took his crying to another level, loudly weeping and making a spectacle of himself. So Joab steps in and tells David that he just humiliated his loyal followers who risked their lives in order to save his life, the lives of his family, and his concubines by showing more love for his enemy who wanted all of them dead than for the people who just fought for him. He tells the spoiled king that he made it clear that he, the officers, and the soldiers meant nothing in the eyes of David. He then says, if Absalom were alive today, the rest of us would be dead, and you would prefer it. He then tells a whiny little bitch to respect his followers, or everyone's gonna leave him. Apparently, this got through, and he quit wishing for his army to be dead in exchange for the well-being of his traitorous son. He then marches off toward Israel, and the massive army that had been against him offers to provide escort back to the city. But it seems he was still in the mood to make enemies of his followers, because he decided that only the soldiers from the southern tribes could escort him, and those from the northern tribes would be left behind, despite the fact that all of the tribes had betrayed him. Why spurn the northern kingdom? Because the authors of the books of Samuel and Kings were from Judah and didn't like Israel, and never passed up an opportunity to slander them. They were also trying to establish Jerusalem as the capital of both nations, something which had never before occurred, so it was crucial to portray the greater nations as being historically inferior to Judah. On the trip back, Mephibosheth states that the king is as an angel of Yahweh, giving us another example of Israelite kings being equated to divinity. And if they keep it up, we'll have to turn this into a drinking game. At this point in the story, Sheba declared that the northern tribes should abandon David because he had spurned them. So they all pack up and abandon David to follow Sheba. So now the northern and southern kingdoms are divided once more. David returns to Jerusalem and quarantined the 10 concubines that had been raped by Absalom, placing them in seclusion for the rest of their lives. So he abandoned them to his enemy, did nothing to prevent their assault, and then punished them upon his return. This is a fantastic leader and role model. So now David needs to deal with Sheba. He's created another enemy by his actions, and now that enemy leads the northern kingdom of Israel. We're basically seeing a revolving door of former allies becoming threats to the throne, and all of it stems from David's own actions. So he asks Amasa to summon the army of Judah so he can hunt down Sheba. Amasa sets out, but David isn't pleased with the progress. He thinks the army could be summoned faster. So he has Joab assassinate Amasa on the road. So he's now killing his followers for obeying him. Sheba took an army into the city of Abel and was instantly besieged by Joab. But Joab wasn't wasting time with a long siege, especially since David's impatience caused the death of Amasa. So he brokers a deal with the locals who turned against Sheba and the occupying army, and Sheba's head was tossed over the side of the wall, and his army was subsequently dispersed. The narrative of David's struggles with usurpers is suddenly interrupted with chapter 21, revealing yet again that these are short stories that are collected and stitched together to create one narrative. The text states that suddenly there was a famine in the time of David that lasted 3 years, but it never states when in David's reign this 3-year famine occurred. It might have been in the beginning, or during the last years of his life, or anywhere in between. It simply states that it was sometime during his reign. David consults an oracle to learn the cause of the famine. In ancient times, these things were never caused by natural forces, but instead were always linked with an angry deity who was punishing an entire nation for the actions of an individual. The oracle learns from Yahweh that the famine is caused by blood guilt brought on by Saul's killing of the Gibeonites. Now, you may be saying to yourself, I don't recall any mention of Saul attacking the Gibeonites. If we flip back to 1 Samuel 13, we find the episode in question. Saul and his son Jonathan were in command of several thousand troops facing an overwhelming Philistine army, and we read there that they fought alongside the residents of Gibeah of the tribe of Benjamin. Wait, what? Let me double check that. Yep, Saul fought alongside the Gibeonites, not against them. Perhaps this section in 2 Samuel 21 can give us a clue. It states that Saul pursued the Gibeonites and sought to kill them off. Now something isn't adding up. Saul never attempted to exterminate the Gibeonites. If we go back, like way back, to the end of the book of Judges, and episode 33, entitled All About the Benjamins, we find an old story similar to the tale of Sodom and Gomorrah. It begins in chapter 19 of Judges, when a Levite priest is traveling with his concubine, and they rest for the night in the city of Gibeah, a city belonging to the Benjaminites. During the night, an angry mob descended upon the house, and the Levite tosses his concubine outside to placate the crowd. He gets a good night's rest while his concubine is abused until dawn, when he finds her dead on the doorstep. He chops her up and sends the parts of her body to the different tribes of Israel, and everyone bands together to exterminate the residents of Gibeah. And then they get carried away and try to exterminate the rest of the Benjaminites. The tribe was almost wiped out because of the zeal of the people of Israel and Judah, a phrase which is seen here in 2 Samuel 21:5. So here, much later in the story, Saul is being blamed for events that were carried out before he was king. Actually, this takes place before Saul is even born. Yet here in 2 Samuel, the guilt is laid at his feet. So there's a bit of confusion as to the timeline, which shouldn't really surprise us. So events of Judges are being blamed on a king from 1 Samuel. So how does a king in 2 Samuel deal with it? If you've been keeping up, there's only one way to handle blood guilt. Someone has to die. David must make expiation on behalf of the previous king, who wasn't even born at the time these crimes were committed. The Gibeonites ask for 7 male descendants of Saul to be handed over to them so they can impale them. Without hesitation, David grabs 7 boys of Saul's lineage and turns them over. Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul, was spared, but pretty much everyone else died. They were impaled on the mountain before Yahweh. They were put to death in the first days of the barley harvest, and Yahweh accepted the human sacrifice and ended the famine. So here we have Yahweh accepting human sacrifice on a mountaintop and being linked directly with a grain harvest, 2 features of ancient Israelite polytheism concerning the Canaanite god Baal-Hadad. And it won't be the last time such a parallel is seen in the Old Testament. Hell, it won't even be the last time such a parallel is seen in this episode, and the episode's almost over. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of the impaled children on the mountain, came out to mourn, camping beside the bodies to prevent desecration by scavengers throughout the time of the harvest. The bones of Saul, Jonathan, and the 7 murdered children were gathered up and buried. When all this was done, Yahweh lifted the famine and restored the land. Now that we've sort of untangled that mess, we can step back a bit and see that this story is not quite unique. It parallels the story of Oedipus and the plague of Thebes, written by Sophocles, in which Oedipus consults an oracle to learn the cause of the plague and discovers an unresolved issue with the previous king. Attempting to match David with Oedipus is the reason Saul was blamed for the slaughter of the Gibeonites. The Greek story works, but in the Hebrew version, the previous king wasn't alive when the crime was committed, so the authors just claimed that he was and hoped that no one would listen to my podcast. In both stories, people are dying, and they ask the king to do something about it. Oedipus and David both promise to bring justice to the guilty party, even though it happens to be someone close to them. Later, Rizpah, the mother of 2 of the children, stays beside the bodies in mourning and secures for them a proper burial, just as Antigone, daughter of Oedipus, sits beside her fallen brother Polynices in an attempt to secure a proper burial for him. And the idea that David's story might have been influenced by Greek literature should come as no surprise. If we take a quick look back at his story, we can find other instances of Greek influence. David uses Cherethite and Pelethite soldiers in 2 Samuel 8:18, which is odd for a Jewish king to be running about with Aegean mercenaries, especially if he reigned before the use of such mercenaries in ancient Palestine. The battle between champions of two opposing armies, as we see in the David and Goliath story, is taken straight from the Iliad, and such a scene appears nowhere in the previous 7 books of the Old Testament. Goliath's armor closely resembles the battle dress of Achilles instead of actual Philistine armor. The succession narrative involving David's adulterous affair with Bathsheba, conspiring to have her husband killed in battle, the prophecy delivered by Nathan, the deaths of multiple sons of David, including his first with Bathsheba as a punishment for the king's actions, and the conspiracy through Bathsheba and Nathan to have Solomon installed on the throne, are all common features of Greek tragedy and seem strangely out of place in the biblical narrative. Compare these scenes to the stories of Oedipus or Agamemnon, and then read them alongside the tales of Moses and Abraham, and you'll see what I mean. I'll link a fantastic article in the show notes devoted entirely to this subject. It's well worth the read. Anyway, back to David. Chapter 21 continues with a jump back to the never-ending war with the Philistines. You'd think that after losing every single war with the invincible nation of Israel and their bloodthirsty patron deity, these people would have eventually learned to avoid conflict. But they don't. This time, they break out the big guns. They send in the Rapha. If you're not familiar with this term, it's okay. The Rapha are giants. They're a type of Nephilim, and the Philistines have 4 of them on their side. During the battle, David grew tired and was almost killed by the first giant named Ishbi-Benob. We're told his bronze spear weighed 300 shekels, or 7.5 pounds. Now, I know a little bit about functional weaponry and that it's typically much lighter than one might assume, but wasn't sure how this spear compared to an actual spear. So I looked it up and found that you can purchase a functional African assegai hunting spear with a 6.5 foot long shaft. It weighs just under 3 pounds. And a much larger but equally functional spear designed for hunting wild boar comes in at about 4 pounds. Both of these are fairly similar to the types of spears used in the late Bronze and early Iron Age. Actually, both spears I mentioned have heads significantly larger than the spears which would have been used here, and yet they weigh significantly less. So this spear is gigantic, and it's meant to be, because it's being wielded by a giant. So this giant, Ishbi-Benob, beats down King David, and his nephew Abishai comes to the rescue and kills the giant. After this, the Israelites declare that David shall no longer be allowed to go into battle, lest the enemy, and I quote, extinguish the lamp of Israel. If you recall from previous episodes, Yahweh was often referred to as the lamp of Israel, and the divine king was often seen as the earthly incarnation of their patron deity. So this is the second time in this episode that David is forbidden to enter the battle, and the second time that he's been compared to Yahweh. A man named Sibbecai killed the giant named Saph, which is our second giant, in verse 18. Then Elhanan from Bethlehem faced off against Goliath of Gath and killed that giant. This is the original tale of a warrior from Bethlehem killing Goliath of Gath. It's set during David's later years, but gets attributed to the king and set during his youth to bolster his legend. Finally, David's nephew Jonathan faced off against the fourth giant, who had no name, but he did have 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. We're told that he had been taunting the Israelites, and only Jonathan was brave enough to face him. These details would be attributed to Goliath in 1 Samuel. It's important to note that here, in the second half of chapter 21, all 4 of these giants were killed by David's men when David was too old and tired to fight, and not by King David. Following this battle is the Song of David, a hymn of praise to Yahweh, which actually has nothing at all to do with the life of David, but it's attributed to the fictional king. It's likely an ancient hymn that the compilers of the book wanted to include, and this was as good a way as any to include it. It's a typical praise song, thanking Yahweh for all manner of successes, and filled with allusions to his role as a war god and a volcano god. His winged chariot throne is mentioned, as is the idea that Yahweh is visible and can be seen by mortals. In this song, Yahweh lives in his temple, which is odd because David didn't build a temple. We're told that Yahweh lives in shadow and in darkness, and he's linked with coals, fire, smoke, and earthquakes. Imagery that doesn't quite fit with the modern Christian notions of a deity. We also see another instance in which El Elyon and Yahweh are mentioned as separate deities. They're contrasted in their manner of speech. In chapter 22, verse 14, we read that El Elyon utters with his voice, but Yahweh thunders forth from heaven. And he also throws arrows of lightning to scatter his enemies, much like Baal-Hadad or Zeus. Another line tells us that Yahweh reached down from above and drew up our narrator from the waters and delivered him from his enemies who were stronger than he. Now this doesn't match any tale in the Old Testament, but it does describe a particular scene in 1 Enoch chapter 65, which might indicate that the myth referenced in Enoch is much older than that particular book, or that it became popular among the compilers of 2 Samuel and was added to the hymn. We also see references to judgment of people based on their righteousness and purity, which is a concept from Zoroastrianism, which is immediately followed by a line that states that people will be divided into separate groups and the holy will be kept with the holy. This too is Zoroastrian in origin and is explicitly stated in 1 Enoch. Yahweh here is called a lamp, just as David was earlier in the battle. Yahweh also teaches his followers how to kill with various weapons and encourages them to hunt their enemies and consume them. Now in this case, he's not actually talking about cannibalism, but one army just completely annihilating another. He incites enemies to rise up against his chosen people so that they can be slaughtered. The song continues, stating that Yahweh is a national God that doesn't listen to the prayers of other nations, but slaughters them instead, and has set the Gentiles to serve as slaves to the Israelites, and foreigners will be turned away from Yahweh because they're not worthy to serve him. Then in verse 47, it states that Yahweh lives and will be exalted, a direct parallel to Psalm 18. Why does the author feel in this verse to state that Yahweh is alive? Now we do see this in other places. This often occurs when a deity has died and resurrected. It often happens in a struggle with a powerful agent of destruction, such as a primordial beast, as we have seen with Baal in his fight with Yam, or Marduk after his fight with Tiamat. The warrior god defeats the water dragon, but dies in the process. Later, he is resurrected and becomes ruler of heaven. So the god fights a dragon, dies, lives, and is then exalted. We have a similar story with Yahweh, who defeated Leviathan. His death is omitted, but the surprise statement that he lives remains, indicating that Yahweh was originally a dying and rising god, like his contemporaries. All of which whose struggle, death, resurrection, and exaltation is closely linked with the cycle of nature, the movements of the sun, and the grain harvest. After the song, we're told that David is speaking his last words. He's anointed a divine king serving under El Elyon, and Yahweh speaks directly through him, giving us more indications that the king is the mouthpiece of heaven and is Yahweh, son of El. So if you've been playing the drinking game, I think that's the third or fourth shot you had to take. David is also called the Rock of Israel, a title that will later be used for Peter, a Christian who serves as the mouthpiece of Yahweh and an anointed servant of El. His last words concern ruling men justly. Perhaps David wasn't too familiar with his own story. Following the last words is usually the person's death, but not in this case. Sometime later, after his last words, in the last chapter of 2 Samuel, Yahweh tells David to conduct a census. So apparently he's still talking. Yahweh wants to know how the nation of Israel has grown. It's been a running theme since the Exodus to keep tabs on the number of Jews in the world. So David has Joab visit all the tribes of Israel and learn their numbers. They even count up the Canaanites that live among them, even though they were all wiped out by genocidal decree several books earlier. 9 months and 20 days later, enough time to have another baby, Joab returns with the count of 800,000 fighting men in Israel and another 500,000 fighting men of Judah. All good, right? Wrong. Yahweh is upset. Why is he upset this time? Because David conducted a census. He gives no explanation for this at all. He commanded a census, David obeyed, Yahweh decided that was evil. Apparently he changed his mind sometime during the count and decided to punish the entire nation of Israel for obeying his command. He offers David his choice of 3 punishments: 7 years of famine in the land, flight from his enemies for 3 months, or 3 days of pestilence. David, apparently unfamiliar with the deity he was conversing with, left the decision up to Yahweh. Pro tip: never let Yahweh decide. He drowns entire planets when he decides. Let the record show that Yahweh is not a good decision maker. So he sends pestilence to the land and kills 70,000 people. Then it says that Yahweh realized that his actions were evil, so he repents for it. He apparently didn't know that murdering 70,000 people for doing exactly as they were told might be evil. Luckily, he realized it eventually. But he apparently was still going around to kill people, because David saw him killing people and said that he alone was guilty of the crime of doing as he was told. I suppose he forgot that it was Yahweh who ordered him to conduct the census in the first place. Anyway, Yahweh is apparently still rampaging, even though he has, admitted his guilt and repented. So, to appease the rampaging God, David goes to the house where Yahweh was currently located. He apparently goes door to door, and he erected an altar at the threshing floor and made a sacrifice to Yahweh. In this case, it was a slaughtered ox. This lifted the plague, ended the famine, and ceased Yahweh's murderous rampage. So we have another sacrifice to Yahweh concerning grain, as the altar had to be erected on the site where the grain was being separated and processed. So that does it for the second book of Samuel. And we'll be back soon to do something a little different. If you'd like to learn more about the show, visit dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to recent episodes, along with a list of material to further your own understanding of Hebrew mythology, as well as a contacts page where you can send questions or comments. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis, and give the show a good review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, thank you for listening.